Welcome. Good morning. Happy Valentine's Day. My name is Vicki Hefner, and I'm the Education Curator here at the Berks History Center. We're very happy to have so many of you here in person and virtually. Just a few quick announcements before we get started with our program this morning. Upcoming second Saturday programs in March. Carrie Moan, a previous trustee of the Berks History Center, a good friend of mine. I met him many summers ago when I worked at the Conrad Weiser Homestead. He will be here on March 14th. Some thoughts about Brother Enoch Conrad Weiser at the Ephrata Cloister. And the April program is on April the 11th, Discover St. Lawrence Village with local historian and author Richard Adams. He has a beautiful book that he published. Currently, our museum store is in transition because we're starting a bathroom renovation project, which if you're a lady, you know we need it. If you're interested in that book, we can still pull it for you and you can purchase it at the front desk. And we do have a May and June program lined up. In May, we're very excited. Pat and Arlen Christ, if you're aware, they own over 1,000 quilts. They live in the Kutztown area. They recently had an exhibit at the Allentown Art Museum. They will be doing our May program on only Berks County quilts here for us. And then in June, I'm doing this from memory. Barbara Blue Jay, and I forget her last name, but she's a Lenape descendant, and she will be doing a history on Pennsylvania Lenape Native Indians and also some storytelling. I do want to announce that on the 21st of February, I'm doing an open weave basket workshop. If any of you have a basket that needs to be finished. And I think at this time, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Benjamin Carter is an associate professor of anthropology at Muhlenberg College, where he has taught for over 15 years. A registered professional archaeologist, Dr. Carter's current concentration is historical archaeology, focusing on the charcoal production in the 19th century and its relationship to the Underground Railroad in southeastern Pennsylvania. Dr. Carter has worked in Eastern North America, as well as Ecuador, Peru, and Honduras. He has earned his PhD in anthropology in 2008 from Washington University in St. Louis. I would like to also add that on April the 11th, following that second Saturday program, Paul Schumann, my hiking guide, where are you? Paul Schumann and I will be doing a hike to Sixpenny Creek. So if you enjoyed today's program, spots for that hike are about half full. So sign up soon. And if you enjoy Dr. Carter's talk, you can actually go explore the area that he will be talking about today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to add one thing. I grew up in sort of backwoods Maine. So I've been wandering around landscapes for a very long time. I've wandered around landscapes. And I'm a wanderer. So if I walk away from the microphone, just go back. Because it's actually really important, because this is probably one of the first times that my mom has seen me present. She's on the inside. Valentine's Day, Mom. So this story is very much a story of landscapes. And that's important because, especially in Black history, evidence is spotty. It's difficult to track. And so adding one more component in which we can track Black history, we can track all sorts of histories, is particularly important, okay? I think it's also important to sort of walk through how I ended up here. As you could tell by the introduction, my background is actually South America. Most of it is actually on, this always sounds funny to say, it's on shell bead production over about 1,000 years. I won't say anything more about that because I could say a lot about it. But I ended up doing this project because I believe that students need to get out and do stuff. And so a big part of this is actually, I sort of developed it slowly over time, just getting students out, and we started with charcoal, et cetera. Okay, so so I want to give you a little bit of an overview. Right? I'm gonna do a little introduction, talk about how I ended up here. We're gonna talk about Sixpenny Creek itself. Then we're gonna talk about charcoal and the landscapes associated with charcoal. And then we're going to talk about the connection between those landscapes and particularly the Underground Railroad in the 19th century. This goes, interestingly enough, when I started working in Ecuador in 1996, one of the smells that I came to recognize was charcoal production. Never, ever in a long time did I ever think that I would end up doing research on charcoal production. So I want to use, this is a bit of an introduction, but also note that charcoal production, the more research I do on this, it is important all around the world, historically and today. So this is not something that it seems weird to talk about charcoal, right? Like you're like, oh, that's not, like hardly anybody uses charcoal, right? No, actually in the world, charcoal is incredibly important. This is just one quick example, right? So I started in Ecuador. This is a good friend and colleague, Pablo Torres, showing us how to make charcoal in Ecuador in 2018. So charcoal's around all over the place. So I started working on charcoal in the Blue Mountain, which I'm sure most people in the room at least know where that is. It's just north of here. And it was a project, again, to get my students out and moving around. When the pandemic hit, it sort of sunk a lot of my South American research for perhaps what are obvious reasons, but it also sunk my field archaeology class. And so what we'd usually do is we spend 8 Sundays, full days in the field. Well, my students were remote. So how do you spend 8 weekend days in the field? And I was like, don't worry, guys, I'm going to go out. And I'm going to, I figured out how to use a 3D camera, and it's like, it would be like you're walking through the landscape, and we can do it that way. And they looked at me and said, no. So what I had to do was adjust and figure out a place where I could do a relatively small number of basically field trips instead of actually working. And we ended up going to Hopewell because Hopewell has, many of you know, they have an area where they do, they make charcoal. Right. And so they have all sorts of signage, and they also have the furnace, and so everything was in one place. Right. So rather than going to the Blue Mountains, we went to Hopewell. In doing that, right, of course, I have to do lots of background history. This was probably one of the key maps, right? Like we have to collect tons of maps, and we look at censuses, and et cetera, right? This one was key in that you can see Hopewell down in the right-hand corner, and you can see all this sort of open land in between of the hills. That's charcoal land. We'll come back to that. But the important part for me was this piece of the map itself. So this, you can see right there in the middle, it says colored settlement. Now, on every other building on the map, there's a name, right? So it's only in this area where people were lumped together and their identities, their individual identities erased. And so I was like, what's going on here? And the more we looked, the more interesting it got. And the more nervous I got, because I am not an expert in Black history. And I'm certainly not an expert I'm certainly not an expert in Black history. So I decided, well, we were left with a decision. A, ignore it. B, work on Black history without having the background. Okay, actually, there's a third choice, right? Because those are both bad choices. A, right, ignoring it was erasing it once again, right? And I was like, I can't do that. The second choice was also not ideal because Black history has not been treated particularly well in the past. And so for me to do it without that background was perpetuating also not necessarily an erasure, but maybe a misinterpretation of history. So what we did was my students and I, we've spent basically sort of 5 years now sort of updating ourselves, reading as much as we possibly can on Black history of Southeastern Pennsylvania. I would never argue that I am an expert, but I'm an expert, or I'm close enough that we can contribute something to the understanding of Black history. Okay. And this map was the key. So I'll introduce you very quickly to Sixpenny Creek. So this is the location. You can see the red blob there. That's Sixpenny Creek, and you can see it's surrounded by charcoal lands. Down in the lower right-hand corner is Hopewell Furnace, and in the upper left-hand corner is Hampton Furnace, owned by the same owners, right? So this, and the land in between is all owned by the same owners, right? Except for that little chunk owned by the Black community. So we had to go back and we did the research and we found out, who bought land first. And I want to point out real quick that purchasing land for Black families was particularly difficult. Okay, it had to do with money. It had to do with employment and the difficulty of employment. It also had to do with some people would simply not sell to Black families. Okay, so it's particularly impressive. And I actually think that one of the things I hope you get out of this is that this purchase was very strategic. Okay, so the first purchase was by Jehu and Dinah Nixon in 1842, and they purchased that green square up there, okay, about 24 acres. Very quickly, they sold pieces of that off to other Black families. So you can see, you can't see Peter Jones, but he's up there. So Peter Jones, John Watson, John DeHart, and Charles Butler, and their families all bought pieces. I'll also, side note, those lots are reconstructed from deed descriptions from the 1800s. If you've ever worked with deeds from the 1800s, you know that's not easy. That little map that you're looking at right there took me about 6 months. In 1856, Aquila Boardley purchased the lot of land there in the lower right, and quickly sold a piece to his son-in-law, Isaac Cole. And the Coles are particularly important in this story, and I'll come back to that as well. Also in 1856, and this is key, in 1856, the Mount Frisbee African Methodist Episcopal Church was constructed. If you know much about the African Methodist Episcopal Church, it was essentially a tool or created to be a part of the Underground Railroad. Okay, so having it here is honestly, that's pretty good evidence of the presence of the Underground Railroad here to start with, but we have more. So this just shows you who lived there. Okay, the community started, as I mentioned, 1842. So we don't have anything for the 1840 census, but this shows you the censuses through the years. Okay, you can see the community grows, right? In 1860, it's 48, I believe, residents with nine different households, and you can see it shrinks. Right, so part of this graphic is putting their names in front of you. Part of it is showing you the size of the community and how it goes. Notice it expands dramatically prior to the Civil War, and then shrinks in the ensuing years. I will also point out that some of this property is still owned by the Cole family, who I work with and who I owe much of what I know about this community. So I'm incredibly thankful for them letting me into their family and have discussions with them, but also into their history. This shows you the value of land at Sixpenny Creek. And there's only one really important piece of information I want you to get out of this, but I also do want you to know that this information comes directly from the Berks History Center. Okay. You can see that most folks, they buy land and it pretty much stays consistent, right? The lines may wander a little bit, but also notice the blue line is the Nixons, and they're the ones that bought the original piece and then sold it, and that's why their property value goes down. It's because they're selling it to other folks. And I do want to point out just a couple quick facts, and this is a little bit of a study that I did based on Chester County, so I didn't use Berks County in this particular case. But I looked at the federal census from 1850, 1860, and 1870, and looked at sort of overall land ownership. And so you can see some of the differences. About 25% of Black families owned some land, and 50% of white families owned some land. Okay. And by the way, those are distinctions that are made in the census. Those are not my distinctions. But the value of those lands is significantly different. Okay. So Black families, most of the land owned by them was valued at less than $1,000. Actually, there's a spike at about $50. Okay, which is pretty darn low. Most white families goes up. Most white families were owning about $1,000 or more. Okay. No, that's just in general. Just the whole plot. Yeah. Yeah. So, and some of these, even the $1,000 properties are, 50 acres. So I won't go too much into this because we have lots more to talk about, but I want to give you an idea of what's happening at the time. So as perhaps many of you know, Pennsylvania outlawed slavery in 1780, but it was gradual abolition. And so again, I'm not going to go through all the details, but about 7,000 people were documented as enslaved in Pennsylvania in 1780. And the last person to be enslaved, it took 67 years for this gradual abolition to actually ensure that there were no enslaved people in Pennsylvania. So there's a good note. Unfortunately, in 1838, Pennsylvania, there was a new constitutional convention. I won't talk about all the other details, but one of the important details for us is that the phrase, the right to vote was changed from any freeman to white freeman. In other words, in 1838, Black folks lost the right to vote. Okay. Prior to that, it was actually very dangerous to vote, but many Black folks did. Okay. Probably most importantly is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This changed everything. Arguably, this is one of the main triggers for the Civil War, and incredibly important in southeastern Pennsylvania. So there was a 1793 act of the same name. This simply gave it teeth. And what it did was create, not to oversimplify, but it created a system in which in northern states, you had roving gangs of quote unquote slave hunters. And you had a sort of a corrupt system. When people were caught, they were taken to commissioners, and the commissioners were not trained judges. They were honestly sort of appointed that could be anybody. Some were really great. Some were really bad. Okay. And there was a built-in incentive. So these slave hunters could capture somebody and take them to a commissioner. If the commissioner found that they were to be sent back south and to be re-enslaved, they got $10. If they found they were not to be sent back south, they only got $5. So you could make twice as much based upon the decision. Again, some commissioners were very good. There were a lot that were deeply problematic. And please note, often this was not because somebody had escaped slavery. These were Black folks who had been free since birth and were captured and returned to slavery. Okay, if you've ever heard, or if ever read or seen 12 Years a Slave, that's the story we're talking about here. And lastly, many of you, I'm sure, know about the Christiana resistance, often called the riot of September 11th, the other September 11th. 1851, really important moment in history in which a William Parker, who was an escaped slave himself, living in southeastern Pennsylvania in Christiana, decided that he was going to work with the community and resist those slave hunters. Long story short, a slave owner was killed and another was injured, and the South erupted. Okay, there's a lot more story behind that, but I just want to sort of give you an idea of where we're at. You guys, I imagine all these history buffs in the room, you've probably heard of John Wilkes Booth. He was friends with the Gorsuches, with Edward Gorsuch's sons. This event arguably led to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, or was a contributing factor. I wouldn't say led to, but a contributing factor. Okay. We also, and I'm going to do this very briefly, but I did a presentation once where I just started talking about the Underground Railroad, and I got a question afterwards from a younger person who was like, "What is the Underground Railroad?" And I was like, "Oh, well, I should probably say something about that." So actually, I'm going to be very quick. So probably most importantly, it was not underground and it was not a railroad. The basic idea was to get enslaved people to freedom in the North. Okay, so in the northern states as well as Canada. It was a very messy network. It's often portrayed in a way in which it's sort of very like clean, like people went from this place to this place. No, it was catch as catch can, and it was messy and all sorts of errors and lots, some people participating and other people. Anyway, so I just want to point out that the work I'm doing now adds in a component to this messiness, to be honest with you, to sort of demonstrate that this resistance movement was incredibly local and based on the ground and literally in the landscape. And that's all I'm going to say, because I could just. Okay. So I said I'd talk about the connection between the Underground Railroad and charcoal lands. So I'm going to go through this quick because we could have a whole presentation about charcoal. Right? You guys agree, right? If anybody ever told me when I was in grad school or something that my research would be on charcoal, it'd be, I would not have believed though. So charcoal was for iron production primarily. It's got all sorts of other uses, but in this area, we're talking iron, okay? So I'm going to go through this relatively quick, right? To sort of talk about production of charcoal. So the first things the colliers, right? That's what a charcoal burner is called, had to do was make a flat spot in the woods, okay? By the way, that flat spot is actually incredibly important. So remember that flat spot because that's actually what we see today. Then they loaded up, piled up some wood. Again, I'm not going to go into details. I want to. Covered it with leaves and then dirt, lit it on fire. Okay. And then because it's sealed in, rather than burning, it chars. Okay. So you get out the other side, you get an incredibly pure fuel. And that's what was then used to fire the iron furnaces. Okay, so this is them raking it out. The picture on the right, you can see how the flat area, the hearth, has really impacted the landscape. Has anybody here ever seen a charcoal hearth in the woods? I was gonna say, I'm gonna bet that there's a bunch. Okay, so here's one. I've taken about 1,000 pictures of charcoal hearths. They all look like woods. They don't look like anything. So this is the closest thing I have to actually being able to see them in the woods. When you're in the woods, you can see them. But the key tool that I've been using to do this research is LiDAR. Okay, so LiDAR is a technology where the planes fly over the landscape. They spray it with lasers. Those lasers bounce back up. And that data can then be converted into a high resolution map of the landscape. Okay. It's a very simplistic way of describing it. It's super fascinating if you get into the details. But this is what you get. So this is a charcoal landscape near Sixpenny Creek. And you can, I hope, pretty clearly, can you see the charcoal hearths? Wild, isn't it? Okay, so this, actually, can I move that? I think I can. Yeah, there we go. So if you look, right, this is a profile, and you can see the profile at the top right, and you can see the slope, and you can see the charcoal hearths cut into the slope. These are all over Pennsylvania, as many of you know. So we did one study, and this is, I believe this is on the resources that I passed out. This is a study that I did with some colleagues, and we used machine learning, not AI, machine learning, to look at all of Pennsylvania. Okay, and we identified, actually, we took a sample. It's like a 30% sample of Pennsylvania, and we found about 30,000 charcoal hearths. Okay, so they're literally everywhere. And you can see this is kind of a heat map. Notice the Blue Mountain, right? Like it's everywhere on the Blue Mountain. So this is your area. So in the upper left, you can see Reading. And in the lower right, or let's see, lower right, you can see Pottstown. Okay, so much of this is French Creek State Park and Hopewell lands, Birdsboro Waterlands. Much of this is preserved, but this gives you a heat map, a density map of charcoal hearths in this area. Okay, this includes about a little over 4,000 charcoal hearths. So when we were looking for charcoal hearths at Sixpenny Creek, and again, this is that polygon, that square is Sixpenny Creek, and we were looking at the charcoal hearths, and you can see next to the charcoal hearths, there's this nice little round thing, okay? Notice they look different. They're not the same. And so we were like, what are these? Turns out they are collier huts, and collier huts are particularly important in this story. Colliers, when they're out in the woods making this charcoal, they would start, a miler start charring the charcoal, but it took a couple weeks. So they could actually, after the first few days, right, risk went down a bit, they could actually start another one. So usually they had like 8 or up to 8 going at any one time, which means they were in the woods for the entire time. Okay, so up to 8 months, right? They weren't out there in the winter. Actually, they were out there in the winter, but they were cutting wood, not making charcoal. And so when they were out there, they had to have somewhere to live. And so they lived in collier huts, which are very simple structures. They're basically a sort of a cone of wood covered with leaves, covered with dirt. Okay, and you can see a couple of examples here. The one on the left, there's the reconstruction is actually still at Hopewell. The one on the right is particularly important because Joseph Johns is the only picture that I have of a black collier. And I'll also make a quick note. Joseph Johns escaped slavery in about 1850 and lived in that collier hut for 50 years. Lived on the top of the mountain, in the woods, in the collier huts by himself for 50 years. That's actually really important in this particular story. No, the one on the right, no. That one is over by Fort Indiantown Gap. Did I say that right? The other thing is that what I've found is that those collier huts became important structures in Black communities. So in the Welsh Mountains, which are, I'll show you a map a little bit later, they're not too far away from Sixpenny Creek. And documentation, newspaper accounts especially, indicate that many people were living in collier huts. In other words, these were not just something that were used by colliers, they were used by Black communities. And I would argue that when you've got this landscape with all these abandoned huts on them, seems like a great place to hide people who are trying to stay out of view. Okay, so it's really hard to prove that. but we're going to try. So this is Sixpenny Creek. You can see the polygons there again, and you can see the individual charcoal hearths, and you can see the charcoal hearths are the circles, and the individual collier huts, those are the stars. The green ones are ones that we've been to and we have confirmed. Our confirmation rate, right? So a lot of this was identified through the LiDAR. Our confirmation rates are about 98% for charcoal hearths, which if you know anything about confirming things in the field, that is like mind-blowingly good. Okay, over 80 is like incredible. For the collier huts, it's a little bit lower. It's more like 60%. So we're still working on figuring out all the details on that one. But you can see the green collier huts there. Notice there's a whole bunch over by Sixpenny Creek. I would argue that these were used to house people who were trying to escape slavery in the South. We know that members of the community at Sixpenny Creek participated in the charcoal industry. It's no surprise. It's actually relatively hard to find them in the documentation from Hopewell Furnace, which is kind of fascinating because I actually think they participated quite a lot, but they may have participated with white colliers acting as intermediaries. This is the only time, I mean, there's 5 of them who are indicated that they're colliers, and no other census indicates that they were colliers. So this is surprising. Okay, here's one of my favorite quotes, and this helps us link the charcoal lands to the Underground Railroad. Okay, so this quote is about Henry Segner. It's actually from the Historical Review of Berks County, which I think folks around here might recognize that, by Wayne Holman in 1958. Quote, an active raccoon hunter and part-time supervisor of charcoal burners, Henry Segner's knowledge of the forested hills was second to none. It was reputed that if necessary, he could send a fleeing party of slaves guided by a charcoal burner in one direction, then lure a group of slave hunters to follow him all night until they were so thoroughly lost in the mountains they could not find their way out for days. I love that story. Right? What a great one of the things that actually I'll make a side note on here is that working in Black history is very different, and finding little bits and pieces of information in all sorts of different places is essential. Right? So this is just one little mention, but notice it connects the dots very nicely. It also connects the dots with knowledge of the woods, right? So Henry Segner's knowledge of the woods is essential here. And notice he's a collier, right? Or even a supervisor of colliers. By the way, this is speculation. I would bet money that he was supervisor of Black colliers. I do have a few other nice quotes from Holman from that same article. Charles Boyer, recalls that the residents of the Quaker Valley, or Hay Creek Valley, which I'm going to bet many here recognize, claiming that any fugitive could find sanctuary at any house along that road. It's a valley, and the road goes right down the valley. The slave hunters ranged that valley too, and when they pressed too hard, runaways were taken into the woods to charcoal burners' huts. Okay, now we've got our link to charcoal burners' huts. And lastly, to avoid pursuers, some fugitives hid in the woods in huts of charcoal burners working for Joanna Furnace. Again, many people here, I'm sure, recognize the name of Joanna Furnace. When I pointed out that there was Hampton Furnace and Hopewell Furnace, over here was Joanna Furnace. So this actually shows you that map. So Sixpenny Creek is actually a little bit off this map, and you can see all the charcoal lands. But I also wanted to point out the Hay Creek Valley right along here. If you know the history of the area, Joseph Scarlett was a very well-known abolitionist and helper on the Underground Railroad. So between Sixpenny Creek and Hampton Furnace was the Hay Creek or Quaker Valley, with one of the more notable abolitionists in the area. More charcoal lands. There's Joanna Furnace. And this one, I kind of love this one. I mostly show it because Henry Segner, right, on the left-hand side here, is actually shown on that map. So you can actually see where he lived and likely the charcoal lands that he was talking about. So to sort of summarize the charcoal lands connection to the Underground Railroad, these were constantly changing landscapes that were I keep saying that they were really messy, right? So as a kid, I ran around landscapes. Many of them had been cut previously. And if you have ever been through a woodlot, you know that like the first, 5 years, they're almost impassable because they're so dense, right? And so then after a few years, et cetera, like they grow and it gets more passable. This would have been constantly changing. Some cut each year, right? So it goes back to 0, some 1 year old, 2 years old, et cetera, right? And you could cut them again at 20 years and then make charcoal out of it again. So they're constantly changing. There's brambles everywhere. There's thickets everywhere. It's just a mess. Who would know how to get through this mess? Colliers, obviously. Woodcutters, the people who are actually cutting the wood for the colliers, as well as hunters, right? Henry Segner just being a great example of this. But I also think that the men in the community in Sixpenny Creek would have been all three of these things as well. There's paths all through these, right? And so they're twisting and turning, right? Because they're to extract the charcoal. They don't go any particular place, but the colliers would have known where they go. There's also those collier huts, which are perfect for, you could easily renovate one, right? That's been fallen in for a couple of years, make it nice and hide it. I'm not sure it was particularly luxurious, but it certainly got you away from slave hunters and out of view. And of course, we can't forget, and I always feel like I don't talk enough about the Mount Frisbee AME Church. That's essential here, and I'm currently trying to do more research on it, but it is really, really difficult because this was a small church, maybe 20 people, and the records are, they probably didn't want things recorded. Even the stuff that went back to the AME Church is very minimal. Okay, so we have almost no conversation or almost no documentation about what happened in this church. But I guarantee you, based upon what we know of other AME churches, it was important. Okay, so that's my argument about the connection to the Underground Railroad. But I also think it's important to recognize that these charcoal lands were essential to the community at Sixpenny Creek for other reasons. So this is the Mount Frisbee AME Church, okay, built in 1856, likely built, by the way, by Isaac Cole, who we have one mention where he's a stonemason. Actually, it's right there in the upper corner, right? So Isaac Cole and his two sons are indicated as stonemasons in the 1880 census. So we're pretty sure he built this place. And there's a couple other stone buildings. This is actually, the more research I do, this is actually quite unusual for Black communities from the time, okay? The interesting thing about this is that we know where they got the stone from. So walking around in the charcoal lands, which I get to do all the time, which is amazing, you can see we started to notice that there were a whole bunch of stones with drill holes in them. Okay, and actually usually half of a drill hole, right? So the stone was drilled, it was cracked, the good stuff was taken away, and the waste was left behind. So these triangles here indicate the waste that was left behind. So the community, the buildings at Sixpenny Creek, including the Mount Frisbee AME, the Watson Miller house, that was that sort of falling down house that I just showed you, as well as the Cole house, which that's on private land right now, and I have very little information about that. They were made from stone extracted from the landscape. And it's particularly important to me or to the story, to understand that the stone was not extracted from their own land. It was extracted from the charcoal lands. It gives you an idea of how they were thinking about the charcoal lands. They weren't, sort of boundary lines where like, oh, don't go on the charcoal land, right? Actually placing their community with charcoal lands surrounding them allowed them access to vast resources. This is one we can track because this, stone stays and remains on the landscape. We actually think that there were a whole bunch of other resources that they extracted from that same landscape. Interestingly enough, we know of 2 wells. One of them on the southern side is not in the land owned by people from Sixpenny Creek. It is on charcoal lands. Think about that. You're putting your primary well on somebody else's land. So it gives you an idea of how they were thinking about that land. That land was not necessarily, there was not a hard and fast line where that's our land and that's their land. Okay. But there's also all sorts of other stuff. Of course, hunting, game, lots of plants. We have all sorts of records of colliers going back into the woods and collecting raspberries and blackberries. Seems to be one of the more important sort of side things that colliers were doing. And so this landscape would have been full of those sorts of things. There's also pawpaws. There's a couple of pawpaw groves right next to the community, not in it, but right next to it. That's not true. There's actually one right next to the Mount Frisbee AME Church. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. I always feel bad because there's so much more that I could say. So I hope you'll sort of ask questions. You guys are like, come on, man, you've said enough. So I do want to sort of wrap this up with a couple quick statements, right? And I don't usually put all the words up there, but I did this time. So small rural Black communities were able to work with the landscape in innovative and creative ways to support their own communities and aid those escaping slavery. Charcoal lands provided all this stuff, right? Wood, charcoal, movement, hiding, stone for construction, and likely all sorts of food. So Sixpenny Creek, as far as I'm concerned, is a unique and impressive community that tells a truly American story. It's part of the larger narrative about how mostly unrecognized small rural, part of the larger narrative about the role, which is mostly unrecognized, of small rural Black communities in the Underground Railroad. The other thing that I've learned that I think is particularly important is that the more I look, the more I learn Black history is literally everywhere. Thank you.